Here I want to begin talking about Paul as a letter writer. All of the documents that we have in the New Testament, all 13 of them that are attributed to Paul, are letters. Letters played a very prominent role in ancient Greco-Roman society. It was a primary way of communicating. And most letters, although there were varieties of different kinds of letters, personal letters, commercial letters, those kinds of things, most followed a basic form. And the form was this: the sender would identify themselves, then they would identify who the letter was addressed to, then they would offer some kind of thanks or prayer for the addressees that they were writing to. Then they would get to what's called the body of the letter, the main part of what they want to say. And then at the end, there would be a postscript where the author would give them a benediction or identify him or herself again. And this is basically how most letters flow. And if you look at Paul's letters and the letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament, all of them follow this basic structure. Paul's letters are also occasional letters. And what I mean by that is that they are occasioned by a particular situation. In every one of Paul's letters, he is writing to respond to questions, circumstances, or occurrences that are happening within the church he's writing to or in the life of the individual that he's writing to. And it's a challenge for us as modern readers to try to reconstruct the occasion that is calling for him writing. For instance, in 1 Corinthians, Paul mentions several times that he's responding to specific questions that the Corinthian Christians had asked him in a letter to him. And he appears to be responding question by question by question. But of course, we don't have the letter the Corinthians sent to Paul, so we have to reconstruct what those questions are. We reconstruct the occasion of letters using something that is sometimes called mirror reading. Now here I'm going to be relying heavily on an article by a New Testament scholar named John Barclay, who wrote an article in the Journal for the Study of the New Testament called Mirror Reading a Polemical Letter, Galatians as a Test Case. You see, Galatians is one of the most polemical of the letters attributed to Paul. And what I mean by polemical is that Paul is arguing against someone. You probably understand polemics if you look on social media and see people debate with one another in the comments section of a Facebook post or back and forth on Twitter. Well, that's an example of polemics. In fact, Galatians is the most polemical of all of Paul's letters. In fact, he skips the thanksgiving part. He identifies himself as an apostle. He identifies who he's writing to, the Galatians, but he skips the prayer and thanksgiving and gets directly to business. Now, mirror reading seeks to reconstruct what the opponents were claiming and what the Galatian Christians were doing based on what Paul says to him in this letter. Let me give you a very simple example. In Galatians chapter 1, verses 11 through 12, Paul says this. He says, "I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel that was proclaimed by me was not of human origin, for I did not receive it from a human source, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ." That's Galatians 1, 11 and 12. Well, mirror reading, we'll look at that passage and conclude, based on what Paul says there, that his opponents were claiming that Paul's gospel was of human origin and that Paul's gospel was not received through a revelation that he had of Jesus Christ. So mirror reading looks at what he says and then infers, based on what he says, what the opponents were claiming and what the Galatian Christians were at least tempted to believe. Now, as you can imagine, there are lots of dangers in mirror reading because it's highly speculative. And here are a couple of dangers to think about. First, there's the danger of things getting lost in translation. Remember, Paul is writing the Galatian Christians here. He is not writing the opponents that have been opposing Paul and his ministry. And so it's very possible that things are being lost in translation, that the Galatians are misinterpreting what Paul's opponents are saying or mischaracterizing what Paul's opponents are saying. And so being lost in translation is a definite danger in mirror reading. Also, a danger in mirror reading is we're dealing with a letter that's very intense. Polemics is not always a cool, rational, level-headed conversation. In fact, a polemical conversation can become highly emotional and even get a little nasty at times, as all of us have seen on social media when polemics happen there. And because of that, in the heat of the moment, it's possible that Paul says things that are not exactly accurate of what the opponents were claiming or what the Galatians were in danger of believing. A third danger of mirror reading is selective interpretation. And that's where we mirror read some passages but not others, and we get only a partial picture of the situation Paul is responding to in our reconstruction. And then probably one of the biggest is a fourth danger of mirror reading, and that is over-interpretation. And that is our tendency to mirror read every single detail can possibly lead us into speculating far beyond what's reasonable and constructing a situation that only exists in our own imagination. So these are the dangers of mirror reading, and yet if we don't involve ourselves in some level of this kind of process, we have no way of reconstructing the occasion of the letter that Paul is writing. And without understanding the occasion, we're not probably going to be able to understand and interpret the meaning that Paul is intending in this letter accurately. So here's a methodology that Barclay suggests, and it centers around 4 different kinds of statements Paul makes in his letters, particularly in Galatians. And those statements are an assertion, a denial, a command, and a prohibition. So let's begin with assertions. If Paul makes an assertion, he claims that something is true. Barclay says that we can assume that his readers may be in danger of overlooking what he is asserting, and that possibly someone is denying what he asserts. For instance, the passage I read earlier, Galatians 1:12, where he says, "My gospel was received through revelation of Jesus Christ." By making that assertion, we can assume that some of the Galatians were probably in danger of overlooking that, and that possibly someone, perhaps the opponents, were denying that assertion, that Paul's gospel was received through revelation. Second is a denial. If Paul makes a denial, Barclay says, we can assume that Paul's readers may be in danger of regarding what he is denying as being true, and that possibly someone is asserting what he is denying as being true. I know that sounds a little confusing and convoluted. Let me give you an example. In Galatians 3:12, Paul says, the law, meaning the law of Moses, found in the Hebrew Scriptures, the law does not rest on faith. Okay, that's a denial. It has a negative in it. The law does not rest on faith. So we can infer, using Barclay's methodology, that his readers were at least in part in danger of believing that the law of Moses did rest on faith, and that in fact it's possible that some of the opponents were claiming that the law of Moses rested on faith. So we have an assertion, we have a denial. Now let's talk about a command. If Paul commands something of his readers, according to Barclay, we can infer that his readers may be in danger of neglecting this command, and that perhaps someone has already disobeyed this command. For example, Galatians 5:1 says, "For freedom Christ set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery." Well, the first part of that passage in Galatians 5:1 is a command: stand firm. If Paul is asserting that or commanding that, according to Barclay's methodology, we can assume that his readers may be in danger of not standing firm, and in fact, some of his readers may have already disobeyed that command. Finally, a prohibition. If Paul prohibits something of his readers, then we can assume, according to Barclay, that some of his readers may be in danger of doing what Paul is prohibiting, and that in fact someone may have already be flagrantly disobeying that prohibition. Another example from Galatians 5:13, Paul says, "For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves of one another." Do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence. Using Barclay's method, we can assume that at least some of his readers were in danger of using their freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, and that perhaps some were already doing so. So that's the methodology that Barclay suggests. And based on that methodology, he suggests reconstructing Paul's opponents this way. Let's begin with what we can be certain of regarding Paul's opponents. Barclay says, we can be certain that Paul's opponents were Christians. They believed in Jesus, they believed in the gospel, at least as they understood it, they were Christians. Secondly, we can be certain that Paul's opponents wanted the Galatian Christians to be circumcised, if they were men, and to observe at least some of the rest of the law of Moses contained in the Hebrew Scriptures. Paul's opponents wanted the Galatian Christians, even though they weren't Jewish, to be circumcised and to observe at least some of the rest of the law of Moses. Third, we can be certain that Paul's opponents brought into question the legitimacy of Paul's gospel and his credentials as an authentic apostle of Jesus. We can be certain that they were questioning whether Paul's message was complete and whether he was truly an apostle of Jesus. Next, we can be certain that Paul's opponents were attractive and persuasive to many of the Galatian Christians. That many of the Galatian Christians were already following these teachings of his opponents and being circumcised and submitting to the law of Moses, or they were seriously considering it. These are the things Barclay says we can be certain of. Now, here are some things that are probable or highly probable. Barclay says it's highly probable that Paul's opponents were not just Christians, but that they were Jewish Christians. It's highly probable that Paul's opponents argued from Scripture, specifically and particularly from the stories of Abraham found in the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Scriptures. It's highly probable that Paul's opponents expected the Galatian Christians, who were not Jewish, to become circumcised converts to Judaism and to observe the law of Moses, as a mark of being part of Israel. In other words, they expected the Gentile Christians in the city of Galatia to become Jewish proselytes, Jewish converts. And then finally, Barclay says it's probable that Paul's opponents had at least some links to the Christian church in Jerusalem that we read about in the book of Acts, that they were at least claiming to represent. So this is what mirror reading does for us. When it's restrained, it's using our imagination to speculate a little bit, but an educated speculation, to reconstruct what Paul is responding to. And this, of course, is not just true of Galatians, it will be true of Romans as well, and really true of all of the Pauline letters that are attributed to Paul in the New Testament.